On tonight's episode of The Conversation, policing, politics, and the fragile trust between people and power. From Laventille to Spanish Town, the stories echo. Crime, corruption, and citizens caught between failed systems and fear. But is this a failure of leadership or a deeper unraveling of the state itself? We're joined by Professors Hamid Ghany and Ramsamooj as we ask the question, is the Caribbean in a legitimacy crisis? And can trust be rebuilt before it collapses? This is The Conversation. How are you? Welcome to The Conversation, gentlemen. How are you?
Oh, fine, thank you.
Fine, thank you. Good afternoon.
Yes, so I want to just jump and start with you, Professor Ghany. What flaws in our constitutional procedure setup does the earlier Harold Christopher episode expose when it comes to police leadership and appointments, from where you stand?
Well, I think that the major issue has to do with the fact that in 2006, the Constitution was amended to remove the prime ministerial veto over the appointment of the Commissioner of Police and Deputy Commissioners of Police, and at the same time to alter the manner in which the President could make appointments to the Police Service Commission. That previously was a presidential function only after consultation with the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition. However, in the lead up to 2006, there had been for at least about 5 years or so an ongoing discussion about police reform and crime activities and what have you. And they came up with this constitutional amendment in 2006 where the government and the opposition, the government led by Patrick Manning and the opposition led by Basdio Pandey at the time, came together and passed these reforms. So they reformed 3 pieces of legislation, but the most important one was the Constitution, in which they set up an arrangement whereby the Police Service Commission would now be appointed on the basis that the President, after consulting the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition, would then send a notification to the Parliament in respect of persons to be appointed to the Police Service Commission. And then the House of Representatives would then vote on the President's nominations, and that would then confirm those persons in office. Of course, the effect of that is that the Police Service Commission is now a political body appointed by the majority party in the House of Representatives. So as the pendulum swings, you may get different memberships of the Police Service Commission depending upon whose term of office is up for renewal or what have you. The second half of the equation was the introduction of a system whereby the Commissioner of Police and Deputy Commissioners of Police would now be appointed after a notification from the President to the House of Representatives and a vote in the House of Representatives. So that what would happen is that the Police Service Commission would conduct or arrange to conduct the interviews, prepare a merit list, send the merit list to the President. The President would then, in sequence, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc., from that merit list, send the top-rated person first, the second-rated, the third-rated, the fourth-rated, if the House of Representatives did not agree. So when the first-rated one went, the House would then vote on it, and if they pass, they approve it, then that is the person who would then be appointed by the Police Service Commission as the Commissioner of Police, so that they abolished the prime ministerial veto and replaced it with a majority vote in the House of Representatives. Now, some people say that the effect of that has been to politicize the appointment and to also create a situation in which the appointment is, there's no backroom arrangement with the Prime Minister quietly indicating in correspondence to the Service Commission that I object to this person or that person.
Yes.
What happens now is that if there are any objections, everything is done out in the open. They were trying to mimic, of course, the United States constitutional arrangements where the president nominates and the Senate ratifies or rejects, as the case might be.
Yes.
And by doing that in a parliamentary system, it's very different. That hybridization does not work comfortably. And what has happened is that, yes, you have greater transparency, and yes, there is open debate, but at the end of the day, you have to depend on Parliament being in session. So the current situation with Erla here with Christopher is she was sent on leave, and then the suspension letter, lifting the suspension, came after she was sent on leave. So the acting commissioner who had been in office during the time that she was on suspension can remain in office, but Parliament has not been reconvened after the dissolution. So the constitutional amendment cannot work because it's no longer a question of prime ministerial veto over somebody that they want to choose. You have to wait for Parliament to be in session.
Before you can have that
having to
sorted out.
wait for Parliament to be in session is problematic because Parliament is not convening until next Friday.
So this one now is for Prof. Derek. How would you rate the effectiveness and the perceived legitimacy of bodies like the Police Service Commission, in this instant?
Thank you very much. I think we have a much deeper problem in the Caribbean. We are still suffering from a sort of colonial constitution. Yes, we've had amendments in different countries, but a sort of piecemeal amendment. If you look at, for example, the service commissions, whether we're talking about the Judicial Service Commission, whether we're talking about the Police Service Commission, or the Teaching Service Commission, or other such bodies or institutions in our Constitution, we've had these perennial problems coming with each successive governments in different Caribbean countries. And I believe a lot more work needs to be done as to how we amend, adjust, or modify our constitutions to meet the needs of our societies. Most of our countries are 50 years plus in independence, and we still practice a colonial type of rule by a constitution that may not be relevant to our existing societies. So the issue is, how do we create better governance through adjustments to our constitution that meets the need of our society? So whether we're talking about elections, electoral reform, campaign finance reform, we all know for the last 50 years what the problems are. But it's only when the problems become unmanageable do we attempt a sort of hybrid, piecemeal type of approach to resolve an immediate problem. And I think the challenge now, as Professor Hamid Ghany pointed out, yes, we have begun to look at the Police Service Commission, but we need to look at the entire structure of our constitutions, understand what we inherited, understand how we've now become into a republic-type state. We see a similar situation in Barbados and maybe in Jamaica, as you remove the head of state being the UK royal family, so to speak. And therefore, I think we need a lot more intellectual capacity and practicality as to how we govern our society. So the Police Service Commission is just one symptom of the failures of our constitution to serve the needs of our society. And I think that's the fundamental challenge in moving forward if we want better governance for our society, our people, our electoral system.
So tell me now, and either of you can chime in on this one, tell me about Parliament's muted response. I want to find out whether or not that reveals a deeper, a somewhat deeper reluctance to defend the democratic accountability there.
Well, there is a problem. I mean, as you know, in Jamaica, you've had a problem with electoral turnout declining. Your last election had about 37%. We had a COVID election in 2020, 58% turnout. This election had nothing to do with COVID, and it was 54, so there was a decline in the turnout. There's some constituencies where the turnout was down to 35% and 36%. So that we're seeing a sort of disengagement, and I think that is something that needs to be looked at. I know that my colleague at the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies at the Mona campus, Professor Lloyd Waller, is undertaking a study in Jamaica to try to understand this declining turnout and why people just are not even interested. And I think that study is going to come out fairly soon. And I think it's important because we need to understand why people are disengaging from the system. They're losing trust and they're losing confidence. And you could excite them to a point, but when you get into a general election and you get a lower turnout in a post-COVID election as opposed to a COVID election, then you have to start pinching yourself and find out exactly what is going on. Why is it that people are not bothering to make the effort to turn out? I mean, the contrast in Trinidad is quite stark. I mean, you have in very rural constituencies like Maruga Tableland in the Deep South, there was 65% turnout. And then you have in Laventil West in Port of Spain a 35% turnout. I mean, what's happening? And those are, constituencies that border the city of Port of Spain, whereas Maruga Tableland is very rural and very far removed from any urban centers.
Yes. Anything that you want to add to that, Prof. Ramsamooj?
Okay. What we saw when we did some field work, some poll work of about 6,000 odd people about early this year, is that a lot of the electorate, about 60 to 65% of the electorate, wanted to see some sort of change, but they could not quantify what that change should be. Whether it's a change of government, whether it's a change of member of parliament, whether it's a change of prime minister, whether it's a change of the minister of finance. And I suspect a lot of Caribbean people are tired with the politics of yesteryear, and the present group of politicians have not inspired the younger generation, have not attracted the medium and small business, and are trapped of having an old-style politics that is not imaginative. So it's more of the same type of policy put forward in the same kind of packaging. And what we saw in Trinidad was a sort of emotive type of campaign, a campaign that lacked any kind of intellectual substance that could attract the middle class. It was song, dance, music, feel good. And the reality now that you have won and there's a high level of expectation of delivery, you realize you don't have the financial capacity to deliver what you promised. So there's this whole populist type of campaign. I will promise you everything.
Yeah.
And then we will see whether we have the finances to deal with it.
After. So then the question that I want to throw to both of you then, do you think that the politics that's currently being undertaken, is it still fit for purpose on one hand, or on the other hand, no, is it just a case whereby individuals, they are disenchanted or disenfranchised, well, disenchanted with what's happening, but they don't know how to articulate what their desires are?
Well, you have a situation in which you had an electoral turnout and you had an election result. The question is, how does that translate into deliverables to the wider population, and to what extent are people turned on and engaged and tuned in to what is happening? Because there's a certain element of people being jaded by the same old arguments being put forward, because the premise of our constitutional arrangements is that we must be divided. We have to be divided. So it is not a situation in which you are looking at a constitutional arrangement that is based on consensus, any kind of consensus approach to politics. It is the Westminster style model of you must have a government and you must have an opposition. So you have to be divided. And that is an important dimension of this. So the principle is the rotation of power between one side and the other. It's not a consensus approach where you operate on a different premise. In our system, it's government and opposition, and it gets exacerbated in societies that are plural, where you have race as an engine of politics and ethnicity as an engine of politics, as opposed to a more homogeneous society where you may have class and other regional differences that may explain some of the political divisions.
So where...
Sorry,
go on.
Remember, there's a distinction between politics and power, right? Our system is designed to acquire power. Politics is a tool used to acquire the necessary power. And if you look at what we've seen in the recent times, the hubris syndrome that was first highlighted with Patrick Manning, we see leaders who serve 2 terms believing they deserve a 3rd term. But we must recognize that political fatigue sets in, the hubris syndrome of leaders emerge, and people are looking for better choices. Your electorate has evolved. So what could have worked 10 years or 5 years perhaps is now irrelevant in attracting new voters. So our politics must evolve if in case people who are politicians want to get or acquire power.
So pretty much you have both answered one of the questions that I had in mind, whether or not the political system is evolving to the extent that the expectations of the people are actually doing so. But then we're going to ease into the break, and so the question that I have on the minds of our viewers now, what if this isn't just about bad appointments? What if it were witnessing a crisis of state legitimacy in entire zones of countries? You know, we want to dig deeper, so continue to stay with us. You're watching The Conversation. We'll be right back after these messages. Welcome back to The Conversation, where I'm having a discussion now with Professors Hamid Ghany and Derek Ramsamooj. So just before we went to the break, there was something that stuck out based on the conversation that we were having earlier. And what I want to ask now, do you think that there's some level of political interference? You know, the institutions are being interfered with, for example, the PSC, or is this a case whereby there's a lack in courage?
Well, the reform that was introduced for the Police Service Commission in 2006 overtly arranges for the members of Parliament and the House of Representatives to determine the membership. So whereas before it was a presidential appointment after consultation with the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition, which was one of the grand reforms of 1976 when we became a republic, has now been altered to the extent that the president only makes a nomination and the members of the House of Representatives will vote. So you are subjecting members of the Police Service Commission to the decision of a party caucus. So whatever the party caucus of the majority wants is what's going to happen. Now, during the debate in 2006, when these reforms are being considered, Basdeo Pandey, as Leader of the Opposition, said that he would not demand that there be a special majority for the election of members of the service commissions or of the police commissioner, because he felt that that should be the responsibility of the government and the government alone. If you made it a special majority, you would transfer that responsibility from the government over to the opposition. And he did not think that the opposition should take responsibility for the appointment of a commissioner of police or even for members of service commissions. So he wanted it entirely to be in the hands of the government of the day. The problem is that in our parliamentary system, when Parliament is prorogued or Parliament is in recess, you can't get anything done if you are going to depend on Parliament to be the body that elects the Commissioner of Police. And that is what happened in this particular situation that this government in Trinidad and Tobago has inherited with the Earl Christopher matter, because Parliament is not opening until Friday the 23rd of May. So we're still 1 week away, and then you still have to have nominations and a merit list and all of that coming forward from the Service Commission. So it's an untidy process, and I think there is the need for it to be cleaned up. The attempt at transparency has provided new problems on the horizon. So yes, you want to be very transparent and put everything out in the open. But on the other hand, you have to look at the fact that it's not working and it has not worked.
Yes. So I appreciate that response. Anything you want to add to this, Prof. Ramsamooj?
Eric, yeah. Sure. I want to expand the conversation that Dr. Hamid Ghany started by saying that this is a much wider problem in the CARICOM membership. So we're not just talking about Trinidad or Jamaica. I could talk from experience with respect to Suriname. Suriname's election is May 25th, 2025. You don't swear in a new government until 2 months later. So in that 2-month period, you may have a newly elected, right, president of a country. However, that person doesn't have the authority until 60 days later. And the political interference of, if you want to call it the executive or the presidential office, with respect to the police service, is a norm in a different type of legal system. So within CARICOM, and there are other instances of that in other Caribbean countries, if you go, for example, in Belize, more than one candidate can go up for the same party in the same constituency. So, for example, you could have 2 PNM candidates go in Laventille West, both representing the PNM, but 2 different candidates. So all of this demonstrates, again, a former British colony, and this happened in the recently concluded election, where the opposition leader had to compete against one of his fellow members of parliament for the same seat, for the same party. So it demonstrates that the constitutional reform in our whole electoral system
is sketchy.
flawed. And if that system is what is going to influence other institutions, like the Police Service Commission and the Teaching Service Commission or the public workers, then you can see where there is a need for a deeper dive in terms of how our constitutions become relevant, because the flaws are becoming more and more evident. And if CARICOM and CSME and the CCJ have to be relevant, then there must be some sort of coordinated aims and objectives
across the region.
And yes.
Yes. So as we transition now, I want us to talk a little about governance and the margins, crime, land, and the state. And the question that I want to ask now, is this really a crime problem as far as we're concerned, or there's a vacuum of governance in spaces where the state truly doesn't have access? And we're moving now from politics, or that aspect of politics, and we're looking at governance now. So that's the question that I want to throw to both of you.
What's the question?
So if whether or not what we're seeing now, the spate of crime that we're seeing right across the Caribbean, I wanted to find out if it's really a crime problem, so to speak, or there's a vacuum of governance in spaces where the state never truly had a presence.
Well, I mean, from what some of the criminologists have said in the public domain, and it's not my area of expertise, but they have spoken about external forces having some kind of influence over the internal operations, and talking about cartels and other things. But that's not my area of expertise, and I won't be going down that road, because if you want an expert opinion on that issue, I would suggest we have someone else speak to it. I could speak to constitutional and political issues, but that's really not my area of expertise.
Yeah.
If I may, in doing the different political campaigns that I've done in the region, like for example, recently in Suriname, the ESG framework, the environment, society, and the governance framework, is part of any sort of funding for any developmental projects. So we see, for example, where you have the extractive industries, whether we're talking about gold, bauxite, whether we're talking about oil and gas, you have the indigenous populations in places like Belize, in places like Suriname, where you have the Maroons and you have the indigenous Indians. land rights are a big part of that type of governance, where they're looking to make land rights constitutionally protected so as to get a benefit from whatever oil and gas and energy type extractive industries. So in any new governance framework now, all of these are part of a political agenda as to how you get the revenue, how it is shared, who benefits in terms of the land rights. And that is big. For example, in Suriname, the experience I've had is when you go to the interior, even the president of the country has to get the permission of the chief of that particular area to enter that physical space. And therefore, also, they having access to the resources or sharing the resources with the multinationals is now part of the national dialogue. So the issue is about a little beyond criminality. The issue is the fair share of the resources of the country, not just only going to central government and their funding, but some of it remaining in the domestic economy, in the domestic geographic space. So that's critical.
Oh, so jumping on that statement that you have made, though, Prof. Ramsamooj, how do insecure land tenure and weak, for example, weak zoning might contribute to ungoverned, high crime communities?
Well, you see, you're talking about within the Jamaica space, right?
Not just.
Now, but what I'm saying, in other communities in the Caribbean, right? The issue is about land tenure. It's about getting the certificate to the land.
Yes.
You have villages in the interior that historically the chief controls the land. It's a communal type land title. You may inherit land, but you have no title to the land, so you cannot take it to the bank to get money to build a home, as the case may be.
Yes.
So you have many land-rich people in the Caribbean without official title that cannot monetize that asset. And I think these are some of the governance issues that must be addressed. Yes. And that is becoming more and more important. Even in Guyana, for example, with all the oil and gas in certain areas. In Suriname, that's also a major player. So the issue of criminality, yes, you have some fair level of deviant behavior, but you also have a bigger issue when it comes to guns, when it comes to third generation money laundering, when it comes to money over the last 50 years now entering the political system, right, where basically campaign finance is not looked at. So it's not a singular issue, it's how the society is structured that allow these challenges for proper governance.
Yes. So based on all that we have discussed, though, just trying to get a fulsome understanding of it, not just governance that we just looked at, but the crisis of confidence earlier that we spoke to. Are there any lessons, and I'll put this to Prof. Hamid, though, are there any lessons that we can draw, whether it's from the wider Caribbean, where we can use those to help us to navigate through the issues that we're currently faced with?
I think the fundamental issue is we have to try to understand why less and less people want to vote in elections. And, as I pointed out, in Jamaica, you've had a situation where you've had a decline over successive elections, the last 3 or 4, where the figures have gone down, and the last election was 37%.
Yes.
We've had a situation where we had 58% in a COVID election, we're down to 54%. And that's one side of the equation, the declining enthusiasm. The other side of the equation is the system of government that we have that is premised on being divisive. You must have a government, you must have an opposition. And the premise of that is divisiveness. So the society has to be divided. And in homogeneous societies, that is perhaps a lot easier to operate. In plural, ethnically plural societies, that can be a little more, fraught with other dangers in it.
Yeah.
And I think that, we need to understand the dynamics involved here, because in telegraphing this all the way down to the level of the ground, and going inside the numbers. In the last general election we saw here in Trinidad and Tobago, as I pointed out to you, the most rural constituency, Moruga Tableland, had a 65% turnout. And one of the more urban constituencies like Laventille West and Laventille East, Morva, and Port of Spain South were in the 30s. So there is obviously something between the urban settings with low turnout and the rural settings with very high turnout.
The
and
expectations might be different.
For the investigation.
Yeah. Anything that you want to add to that, Prof. Derek, before we go to the break?
Sure. To me, the fundamental issue is how do we control the transactional politics? And that is where we see a different type of politics being practiced now in a much more obscene way. People basically sell their vote directly or indirectly. At some points in time for cash, at some points in time it's for some types of resources, at some point in time it's influenced by government contracts within the construction sector or other sectors. And I think that's one of the challenges our Caribbean electoral systems have. How do you control the growing perspective of transactional politics? We see that in every single country. I've come back from a country in which a public meeting, there is lots of food available and 2-for-1 alcohol available to everyone, plus transport, plus money for galvanize and whatever else. And that's a sad reality. I understand and appreciate the principles of politics and the high moral and ethical standards. But there seems to be at times a bridge between the, if you want to call it the oligarchies who run the economy, who purchase political influence. And I think we talk all about the Constitution and constitutional reform and electoral reform and campaign finance. But so far, all we've had is a phenomenal amount of chatter and no real consequence to bring a better type of governance in our society. And that only increases as our economy takes a battering and as the poverty level increases. Food inflation and other type of inflation will induce a certain type of political behavior for a transactional benefit.
Oh, thank you. So we're going to ease into our next break now. And firstly, I just want to thank Prof. Hamid Ghany for staying with us. And I hope that you'll continue to abide with us, Prof. Derek. So when we come back, we want to investigate whether the institutions meant to protect us have themselves become part of the dysfunction. Continue to stay with us. We'll be joined by Mr. Martin George. He is an attorney at law and a member of the Trinidad and Tobago Business Chamber and former president of the Police Service Commission. Continue to stay with us. Welcome back to the conversation. As we start now, I'm going to head directly to Mr. Martin George, and I want to ask the question, from your experience on the Police Service Commission, is it broken beyond repair or is just being mismanaged?
The thing is, you know, the challenge we sometimes have with our institutions, particularly in the Caribbean, is the question of, do you try to change the wheel entirely or do you try to fix it? But the reality is that it's always in motion. The vehicle is in motion. So which one do you do? Do you change the entire wheel while the vehicle is in motion, which is a much more difficult process, or do you try to fix and, you know, patch the wheel while the vehicle is running? And in terms of the Police Service Commission, it is part of a slew of, you know, institutions which we in Trinidad and Tobago have spoken about repeatedly are due for overall constitutional reform. when we sat there at the Police Service Commission, we actually did a self-analysis. We undertook a detailed, extensive study and review. We made several proposals as to how we can, fix it while the wheel was still turning. We suggested, that we needed full-time commissioners. We suggested that you needed to have a 5-year term, so therefore there's no question of, you saying, well, look, after 3 years, you have to be rotated, that, or any sort of thing like that. So we tried to put things in place because we recognize the challenges that were faced by our Police Service Commission. Now, one of the things I want to tell you is that we also suggested and recommended that we set up a body such as INDICOM, because that's where I think Jamaica has a distinct advantage over Trinidad and Tobago. Because your INDICOM is basically the independent commission which is responsible for complaints or matters in terms of, all areas of your defense apparatus, including your police force. So therefore, you have this overall constitutional body that is able to, investigate and do these things. In Trinidad and Tobago, we have the PCA, which has been set up, but the director of the PCA has repeatedly said, that he needs more resources, more strength, more power, more authority, and that has not yet happened. But I think that definitely I will make a plug again to our government in Trinidad and Tobago that we should set up a body such as INDICOM, because they have proven to be particularly effective. Because we have been following their work, not just from the perspective of the Police Service Commission, but I'm also one of the directors on the board of the Crime Stoppers Trinidad and Tobago. And we are in contact with your Crime Stoppers body in Jamaica. And we share information regularly with them. And they have shown us how the INDICOM has worked effectively to manage, monitor, and, in a sense, provide that level of oversight for your armed forces and your security forces and your police force in Jamaica.
Okay, good. So, Derek, do you think that the regional police forces are truly equipped and insulated to the extent that they're able to earn public trust from that?
Okay, so first of all, Kwame, good afternoon to my colleague, Mr. George. The reality is we have no shortage of human resource capacity among 16 CARICOM countries that understand the challenges of crime and criminality in our society. We've had no shortage of paper, research, writing, white papers, green papers, different kinds of strategic reports delivered over the last 50 years. What we lack is the political will. The political will to do what is necessary to fix our society, and a willingness to bear that political consequence, whether we're dealing with garrison constituencies or money influencing politics. What is also important is the whole notion of technology. For example, the utilization of different types of drones, as the case may be, so as to preserve our borders. But we have challenges when it comes to dealing with U.S. regional security, when it comes to the license required for the type of drones you wish to use, and whether it's tied aid out of Southcom. So we have high-level challenges within global stakeholders in securing our borders. And when you look at the problems you may have in Venezuela, in Guyana, in Guatemala, right, in the whole movement of Haitians crossing the borders, the migration elements of it too. So it's not just in your internal borders, it's the people who are coming now with the migration that is coming and the kind of technology that is needed. So CARICOM, you had this big conference about the crime was a public health issue, but CARICOM has yet to be proven to be a bulldog with teeth, so as to be able to coordinate amongst our CARICOM countries, as well as how to stave off, basically, regional interlopers. Yeah. And I think that is where Martin is correct, where we share knowledge, we share technology, we share the criminal records up and down the region.
Yes.
We look at our whole immigration situation. And we had it for the cricket when we had the World Cup cricket of sharing certain things.
But we're not doing it for crime. So then this leads me to the next question, though, as to whether or not confidence in state institutions are eroding. If they are, why so fast? And why is this done? Why is this being done across the region? If that's what you think.
Well, if I could just be allowed to comment on that one, because I would think that our politicians are largely to blame in that regard, in the sense that what you have seen, I mean, in Trinidad and Tobago, and I would imagine in other countries across the region, is that when politicians don't get their way, they then try to attack institutions. So for political gain, for short-term political gain, they will disparage and demean, our institutions simply because they didn't get their way, or, they are not able to do what they want. And then, of course, when you have, political followers who are merely sycophants, who basically just toe the line of the political party and they repeat as a narrative whatever the political leaders say, then, of course, that now becomes embedded in the minds of the public as well. Yeah, maybe it's true. Maybe that institution is really corrupt. Maybe it's really failing, that kind of thing. And we always have to guard against that, because I'll tell you something. Without our institutions, we are nothing. Our institutions are not perfect. Let's understand that. They're not perfect. But then you look at the wider society, look at the wider world. Okay, look at what is happening in the US, where you had Mr. Elon Musk coming in and dismantling institutions of state, institutions of governance, and basically making a mess of things until basically you're not hearing anything about him anymore, because he realized that, look, Tesla was suffering as a result of his interference by the use of Doge. You cannot use a hammer where a scalpel is the tool that is needed. You've never seen a surgeon perform surgery with hammer and tongs. You need sometimes that delicacy, that touch of, softness and tact to ensure that you get things right. And sometimes I think really and truly our politicians, they tend to paint things with a broad brush, and basically they throw out the good with the bad simply because it suits their narrow political interests at the time.
Yeah. So then now, how do we distinguish leadership failure from a deeper system or design flaw in our systems rather? I think that's the reasonable question to follow up with.
Okay, so
it's a good question, and Derek could chime in.
Sure. If you look at the whole notion of leadership in the Caribbean, yes, we have the politics, yes, we have power, but equally we have this disease, a disease called hubris syndrome. And most of our human beings who become politicians believe they're the next best thing to God. Because in our system, we democratically elected someone who could be a potential democratic king. That's a real oxymoron. So the reality is, the hubris syndrome, our leaders must recognize, as Martin is saying, the institutions bring value, but our political leaders use the institution to put themselves in office. And the hubris syndrome sets in when leaders believe they can manipulate the institutions to do their bidding. We have seen that recently in Trinidad, and we are beginning to see signs of that even in Jamaica, where our leaders, our political leaders, believe that they know what is best, and they have tend to forgotten the value of the institutions. So the democratic will of the people must be understood. People want change. People want a better quality of life. That's why in the US you have 2 terms, right? In Mexico, you have 1 6-year term, as the case may be. So we ought to have a constitutional reform and term limits. There is a reason for that, because our leaders tend to lose a sense of reality of what the average citizen feel, the insecurity when it comes to food prices, when it comes to their safety, when it comes to their old age health care, when it comes to their pensions. And they become so isolated in living in this ivory tower. and they begin to look like Cervantes, Don Quixote, and Sancho Pancho, right? Looking for mysterious wars. So the issue is to fix our crime and criminality and keep our society safe. Sometimes we need to change our leadership who have a close affinity to what the average family is facing. And I think that's where our politics is at the crossroads of our society.
Wow. All right, so I think with that we're going to our final break, and the question that's on everyone's lips now: if the system is flawed, where do we begin the work of restoration, and can we do it before trust collapses completely? Continue to stay with us. You're watching The Conversation. Welcome back to The Conversation. Just before the break, gentlemen, I was just musing, and I was listening especially to what Mr. George had said. And the question that I want to throw, especially to you though, Mr. George, what would real reform of institutions like the PSC or the Ministry of National Security actually require? Because I hear that you'd want to have something similar to INDICOM or another oversight body for the military, for the police force. What would that look like, and what would that actually require?
Okay, the thing is, you see, what we have to do is move away from these persons who are politically appointed or, politically replaced, right? The cycle occurs every election time in Trinidad and Tobago, where you have persons who, for one reason or another, because they may have been thought to be of one political persuasion or another, they are the ones who are changed out. So you see it in all the state boards, you see it in lots of, major institutions, that you are changing them simply because one would think that, they are of one political persuasion or another. What we have to do is establish certain institutions which are totally above the political fray, above the cut and thrust of the daily politics. So therefore, you have a scenario where, regardless of which political party is in power, you can have that continuity of overall strategy in terms of major issues. It has to be on major issues. So you're talking major long-term strategies and policies in terms of like how you manage the economy, because we have seen in Trinidad and Tobago billions of dollars being wasted every election cycle when a new government comes in and they decide, well, they are stopping this project that the previous government embarked upon, regardless of whether it's good for the country or not, It's not a question of whether the country is benefited. No, they are stopping it, just out of political spite and ill will because it wasn't their project and they are not able to have that level of control that they would like. Derek will understand what I'm alluding to. And that's the reality. And we are wasting money going around in circles. We like the Israelites for 40 years, just wandering around in circles in the desert, and you're making no real progress. And interestingly enough, in Trinidad and Tobago, and I'm sure in other islands in the Caribbean, including Jamaica, you've seen scenarios where when they are in opposition, they are saying all the right things, making all the nice promises, and they're saying, well, yes, when we get into power, we will do this. We will not be like how the current government is. And then all of a sudden, it's the George Orwell classic Animal Farm all over again. You see Napoleon and Snowball, and they are now walking on two legs, and they're saying 2 legs good, 4 legs bad. Whereas previously they were saying 4 legs good, 2 legs bad. So the thing is, they assume all the characteristics, of those who they were criticizing before. And, it's the classic scenario of the oppressed now becoming the oppressors and doing exactly the things that they castigated and chastised in the previous government. And that is a major part of the problem. So we of the Caribbean, we, the people, the citizens, we have to understand that we have the power. We must not get so carried away by our political beliefs that we think that we are going to subsume that to the good of the country. We have to start choosing country first and then politics second.
Do you share those sentiments, though, Derek? Are you saying the same thing that Martin has been saying so far?
I think Martin has been very diplomatic. If I may not be diplomatic, we have had no shortage of prime ministers who adopt a position that they are above the institutions of their country, they are above the institutions of their party, and they are above basically the constitution. Example, for quite a while, over 50 years, the Caribbean countries have been trying to put integrity commissions in place where public officials can demonstrate unexplained wealth or their wealth. And now we have that entire integrity commission type of institution being ignored by incumbent politicians who, while they argue to put it in office, do not respect it by do not filling in the relevant applications. And therefore, the political maturity, not just of the average voter, but of the national stakeholders, whether it's the media, whether it's the business community, whether it's the different NGOs or churches, must hold persons who wish to hold public office account for their well-being. And playing semantics and believing you can fight a morality issue in a court of law, whose court of law sometimes have an ethical problem, right? We have to look at how we utilize these challenges. Now, let's be clear. Our societies are evolving. We see the same thing happening in the United States with the acceptance of a multi-million-dollar airplane. So ethics and morality, regardless of how old our societies are still a major challenge.
Yeah.
So you cannot blame the person who is bribing some official in the public service to get a license to do X, Y, Z, when at the leadership level, we have these issues. Look at Singapore. Singapore basically will give you a private sector salary for holding public office, but you will be jailed. And that's the issue. We have laws on the books without the consequence of questionable behavior and guilt.
So there's no teeth then. So there's no teeth. Basically, that's what you're saying. But then the question that I want to throw in as far as that is concerned, though, are we seeing then a legislative failure, or this is simply a chronic lack of political will?
I think, if I may, it's not only legislative failure. It is a societal acceptance that this is how we do business, right? And it's okay for Mr. X or Mr. Y to steal because I belong to his tribe. I belong to his party, right? So the rules are bendable according to the beneficiary of such a behavior.
Is that what you find too,
right.
Mr. George?
Quite right in that regard. If I could just add, the reality is that, we've had scenarios in Trinidad and Tobago where a leading politician went on a political platform and said, all are we thief, and that was a big joke he was trying to make, and the unfortunate fact is that what we have seen repeatedly is that, okay, it is criticized when the other side is doing it, but then when your party is in power, it's okay for the bribery and the graft and the corruption, because your members are the ones who are benefiting from it and they're the beneficiaries of it. So we are actually the architects of our own destruction. If you look at, any book or article where they talk about the curse of oil wealth, it looks like Trinidad and Tobago can actually be a case study for that. Because if you don't manage things, if you think of, say, for instance, Norway, how they have been able to treat with their Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, which is nearing close to $1 trillion in value now, right? They were able to say, hey, listen, we are putting our oil wealth away, we are locking it away, we are going to take care of the society. So therefore, your schooling, your education, your healthcare, they're taking care of all of that, all right? But the point is, they are not allowing the politicians to get their grubby little hands on the patrimony of the country, right? So that is the type of leadership and guidance we need in the Caribbean, because too many of them, of our leaders, behave like tin gods. You know, they set themselves up as, they are, king of the hill, and I do as I say and not as I do.
So the question that I want to put at you now is, how can civil society, academia, and youth movements be built into the structure of the public accountability now to help to stave off or to establish some of what you're recommending?
Right. So it starts with programs such as this. So I want to commend yourself and the SportsMax program, and of course my other fellow guests, Derek and Hamid, who were on it. Because you see, we have to start raising the level of public discourse. We have to move above the humor and rumor and the Movilang and the Bacchanal. We all love that as Caribbean people, and there's nothing wrong with that. But there's a time and place where you ought to be able to engage in serious conversations as to how you are going to start to restructure the thinking and the ethos of the people from the ground up, so that people understand that, look, hey, when you see a politician stealing, that is your future, that is your child's future, your grandchild's future that he is tampering with. So therefore, regardless of whether he's from your party or not, you are supposed to be outraged because you are saying, hey, listen, this is not the way to build a society. So we have to start doing that rethink, and that it will take time. It will take time, but the conversation has to start somewhere. And, it's said that the longest journey begins with a single step. And we of the Caribbean have to start making that step individually and collectively, because we have to leverage the strengths of this body we have called the CARICOM, which you sometimes wonder as its utility, effectiveness, and efficacy over the years.
Yes. So go on, Derek.
If I may just add, we have to be also aware. If you look at the Trinidad experience with respect to energy, if you look at the Jamaica experience with respect to bauxite, if you look at the tourism with all the all-inclusives that are coming onto our shores, if you look at the energy sector, what we see happening in Guyana, what we see happening in Suriname, the role of the Chinese financiers, the role of U.S. energy companies, we see how we are not negotiating in the interests of our people in terms of the benefit of these resources. So the 50 years of extraction wet by our resources to multinationals, starting from Tate and Lyle, starting from the rum industry, we have to have skillful negotiators. And that's one of the challenges with all the education and academia we have in the region. We still rely too much on our foreign entities demanding what their pound of flesh will be. And I find it stressful that we have levels of poverty that we should not have in places like Guyana and Suriname.
Yeah.
And where CARICOM and the international negotiators, people, right, like Mr. George, all the lawyers we have in the region, all the economists we have, and we're still going cap in hand begging for soft money, going to IMF, that's our first port of call, when we have so many multi-millionaires in the Caribbean.
So then, Derek, explain to me then, or well, not explain, but are there any regional or international models that can offer some amount of hope for institutional reform in our region?
But why do we need to copy it? And that's the problem. We keep copying. CARICOM was a copy of the European Union. Why can't we, as Arthur Lewis and them began to say, Lloyd Bess, right? We use our human capital and develop the systems that we need. We have our professionals going to the Privy Council and arguing cases. We have our professionals negotiating with the oil and gas companies. Why do we have to believe we have to copy a model of economic existence when we have the capacity? Let us have the political will to hold the policymakers to account and shape policy and drive it. Private sector needs to play its role, not just to extract from our people, not just to keep them in the tourism sector as waiters and waitresses,
but to invest
right,
in
or
them as well.
cooks, but to invest in them and develop our own indigenous entrepreneurial capital. And I think that's
in that regard,
yeah.
I just want to commend, and I
Sure.
have to commend the private sector organization of Jamaica, because they are a very vibrant and robust body. And, I know they argue passionately to champion their cause and, to ensure that they build that sort of resilience within the Jamaican economy, which definitely is going to be the precursor for overall growth and wealth building in the country. So, I mean, I really have to say that they have done well there. One other thing I want to just make mention of, in relation to the current imbroglio relating to, your performer, Mr. Cartel, who will be a guest in Trinidad. The thing is, I saw he put out a very nice video where he explained the circumstances. He said, well, look, hey, he's coming to Trinidad to perform in a show, and all the other ancillary events which may have been scheduled by other persons, or for other areas. He said, really and truly, his focus is on the performance, and even from the government standpoint, they also indicated that, look, they have no difficulty with the performance. It's the other events that they had an issue with. So I don't think there's any, inter-Caribbean, internecine warfare or any Trinidad, Jamaican contention going on there at all, because at the end of the day, Cartel has come down. He actually has been a brand ambassador for Angostura, one of our leading rum brands.
Yes.
They had a big event hosting him and stuff like that. So at the end of the day, we have to leverage the synergies that we have amongst our people. Our human resource capital is one of our greatest assets, but we have to start thinking outside the box and start thinking of new strategies. Think of, for instance, tourism. If we start marketing the Caribbean as one region,
is that the role of the CTO, though?
Benefit from that.
Is not the role of the Caribbean Tourism Organization?
Well, maybe you should have them on your show and ask them those questions.
But Martin, in Jamaica, in Mobay, was it Mobay or Negril, where there's a big hotel, the brand new 1,000-room hotel. There was an ecotourism conference a couple weeks ago, and you had basically the head of the THA coming across. But something like that, where you talk about ecotourism, and this was a conference of about 400 or 500 people, sit. And those are the kind of conferences we need to have more Caribbean people, their presence being there. So to develop the human capital, we need to have this CSME further expanded, and where skill sets can be shared and experiences can be shared if we have to develop a single economy. And I think that's important, especially when it comes to dealing with foreign currency movements, when it comes to dealing with US dollars and different kinds of money coming in, whether from China or India, right? And this is the kind of conversation the next 10 to 15, 20 years is what is needed. Our bandage-type politics, when there's a sore, we put a bandage.
Yes. Can't work.
It can't work. It can't work in the geopolitics space.
So to both of you now, as we look to exit the program, what would a legitimacy blueprint for the Caribbean look like? One that connects trust, crime, and democracy, and all of those things.
Well, okay, if you look at, for instance, the EU, and you look at the free movement of people, free movement of labor that occurs there, and particularly within the Schengen area countries. I've moved around Europe, to several different countries, and not once anybody even asked about, a visa, a passport, anything of the sort. But even just to move from one Caribbean island to another, think of all the red tape and bureaucracy we have embedded. So that's why I am calling out CARICOM, because I think that as an institution, it has failed us. And I make no apologies for saying so. You know, you look at how everybody is trying to ensure that they get their, you know, groupings together. You look at brink, you know, you look at how other areas are, you know, even some of the African countries are trying to bond together to ensure that they can now have some sort of leverage, because in unity there's strength. We in the Caribbean don't understand that simple concept. We are always trying to, you know, compete with one another. You know, you're always doing one-upmanship, and, you know, you always, I mean, if you're doing it in jest, then that's fine. But once you talk in serious issues, why can't we leverage our strengths, our resources, our people to ensure that we all are going in the same direction? Because listen, nobody's coming to save us, you know.
Yeah.
There's no Messiah coming to save the Caribbean. We have to figure this out for ourselves. And we have enough brilliant, intelligent, capable persons within our populations to be able to provide the blueprint for solutions. But the thing is, we, the citizens, have to ensure that we don't allow the politicians to destroy the dream for their own narrow, selfish purposes.
Derek, you get the last word on that?
If I may, one, I agree. We must have a smoother, simpler transition. In the OACS, you can travel with within the OACS with your license. Between Jamaica and Trinidad, we can't. We have to give a passport. So that process must be simplified. Secondly, the movement of capital must be made much simpler. Thirdly, if I have a fully functional company in Trinidad, I should be allowed to use that same entity to do trade in Jamaica, right? So for example, a company in Trinidad can open business in Suriname without registering a new company. Just take your articles of association to say you can legitimately trade. So the movement of capital, the movement of business, the movement of people must be ensured. The movement of pensions. So if you move from country A to country B, your pension can also move with you. Your movement of access to medical care. So if the Caribbean is talking about unity, it must not be idealistic. It must be practical. Yeah. And as Martin said, if we don't fix ourselves, we will be exploited by people who are visitors to our shores. I am all for tourists, but I also want to ensure that our people benefit our resources.
All right.
And we also need to create space for our diaspora to play a part in our development. Because if they hold our Jamaican passport, our Trinidad passport, they must participate, must have the access to participate.
All right. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining me on the conversation. And the question now I turn to the public. When the police lose public trust, when governments waver and institutions fail, the people don't disappear. They should organize, they should demand, they should reimagine. And maybe, just maybe, that's where we'll find all the answers that we're looking for. On behalf of the entire CeenTV production team, I'm Kwame Thomas. This has been The Conversation.